Can Europe compete? Part of the answer on display in Hall 5 of the Paris Motor Show, which opened its doors to the public on Tuesday. Chinese maker BYD signaling its play for the French market with affordable, albeit subsidized, fully electric models. We'll ask about EU pushback against those subsidies and how the homegrown competition's faring. Governments invested massively in the switch away from gas guzzlers in what seemed like a masterstroke for the continent, both in need of tackling climate change and proved a fresh start coming out of the pandemic. Now, however, public money's running dry. The most glaring example right here in France, forced to slash its subsidy to EV buyers. We'll ask if a burgeoning electric vehicle market could cave. As we recently saw when looking at the U.S. presidential race, we'll see how here, too, the green transition's become kind of a battleground in bitter culture wars. So where is the middle of the road on this one? Today in the France 24 debate, can Europe's EVs get up to speed? And joining us, Peter Siegel, news editor at Automotive News Europe. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Welcome to the show, Maria Eugenia Sanin, Applied Research Coordinator at Paris-Saclay University's Center for Economics.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks for being with us. Nicolas Mélan, Senior Advisor at consultants EV Volumes. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, good evening, Francois.
You can react, and you have, on the hashtag F24debate. Now, to entice old creatures of habit, one of the stars of this Paris Motor Show is French-made, a revived fully electric Renault 5, the popular small-size sedan produced between 1972 and 1976 by the maker. Of course, Peter Siegel, this was a car for people who needed to get to work, didn't have a lot of money necessarily. Sticker price starts at a little under 34,000 euros.
Well, it does now, but eventually the idea is to get that price down to below 25,000 euros. And it's one of the most anticipated cars of the last few years, actually, because of all the good feelings for the original Renault 5, which by the way, was actually in production from 72 until the early 90s in various forms. And Renault sold millions of them. So a lot of people have good feelings for that car. And the new EV so far has been a hit. People who've driven it love it, but we'll see if Renault can actually deliver at below 25,000
Because
euros.
revivals don't always work. You remember the new Beetle? That wasn't really
Yeah, that's true, but this is sort of a clean sheet car with electrification and the idea that you can sort of move into decarbonization with a little bit of style. A lot of EVs so far, like the Renault Zoe, for instance, have been less than exciting designs, let's put it that way.
Yeah, and the motor show, Nicolas Mélan, the thoughts on cars like the Renault 5, is that the way to entice people to buy more of them?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, people are looking for nice-looking cars, and electric cars has not always been very nice-looking. Tesla was the first one. They are looking also for smaller car because electric cars is used mostly for commuting, and they're looking for affordable car. And so if you make a very nice looking car that people can get for less than 25,000 euros, then they're going to start to be willing to buy those cars because it's still a lot of money, 30,000 euros to get a new car.
Still a lot of money, and subsidies, cash handouts are getting smaller. Let's cut to the chase. A sharp drop in EVs for the first 9 months of this year has all the stakeholders on edge. But worldwide, there was news, came out on Tuesday, of a sharp rebound in September, more than 30% in 1 month, largely thanks to a nearly 48% jump of sales in China, with increases as well in places like Germany and Italy. You can see on this graph the parts in red are the Chinese market for EVs. Europe is the bit in blue, so a distant second, if you will. Automotive News, your publication, notes a paradox. Batteries are cheaper, but sticker prices on electric vehicles are higher. That's because luxury models have been selling a lot. This article predicts that in 2025 and beyond, the prices will drop. New models coming in, Maria Eugenia Sanin, priced under 25,000 euros a year. Is the future electric?
That's a very difficult thing to announce. The only thing we know is, first of all, that according to our research, the richest population, so the 10th decile in France, has a median of expenditure in cars of 20,000 euros, which means that most of them actually buy second-hand cars, and only few of them, even we are talking about the 10%, the richest 10% in France, only few of them have been able to afford new cars that for now are much with a very high price.
Because the problem with an electric vehicle is you pay a lot up front for the actual vehicle itself, but then there's less maintenance, and of course it's much, much cheaper to charge it.
Absolutely, and when I'm talking about this median, because indeed that's the median price they paid for all cars, not just for electric vehicles, which means that we need to think about the car market as a second-hand market. Most of households buy cars in the second-hand market, and so the prices they are looking at, we need to not only to think always about this new cars market, which is the only one that is going to be affected by this mandate.
So it must be doubly hard for you to predict because of the fact that second-hand electrical vehicles are very new.
They are very new, and most probably they're going to take some time before they actually become affordable for the people that are actually. So the target for these new vehicles, it's going to evolve over time as they become second-hand electric vehicles.
Well, it certainly feels like a roller coaster ride. Till just a few months ago, Europe was hailing its homegrown success story in the battery industry. The continent lags badly on that score. This Wednesday, Swedish battery maker Northvolt announcing its first 400 layoffs, more to come. The stock has dropped 85% since production delays forced it to scale down to a core activity of battery cell making. Yeah, this was built up as the success story. Peter Siegel, what happened?
Yeah, Northvolt was a sort of a confluence of a number of sort of circumstances, some foreseen, some unforeseen. They came in with creation by several ex-Tesla employees in 2016. They have investors including Volkswagen, Scania, which is the truck maker. Goldman Sachs was an investor. Well-funded, but what they found out was that it's really hard to start up a battery factory. There is an initial huge amount of waste, up to 50% when you first get rolling, so you have to discard those cells. They had a big contract with BMW. They apparently couldn't deliver on time, 2 billion euros, it didn't come through. We heard complaints from Scania, the truck maker, that they were missing some of their targets. And then on top of that, you had the EV sales slow down this year, and it's starting to crumble. Demand for electric vehicles is not meeting the capacity of both battery factories and car assembly factories.
And yet Tesla continues to make inroads. It's gotten initial approval to extend its battery factory outside Berlin.
Well, it's not actually making cells in Berlin yet. That's the key difference there. You know, well, Tesla is always the outlier in these discussions, conceived from the beginning as a vertically integrated electric vehicle company, which was similar to some of the Chinese companies like BYD, where they own the value chain, they control the value chain, compared to the European legacy automakers, which have this entire sort of value chain of internal combustion cars that they're dealing with at the same time with tens or hundreds of thousands of employees. So Tesla is, again, somewhat off to the side in this particular discussion.
You know, Nicolas Mélan, we're speaking on the day when the Paris-based International Energy Agencies unveiled its global report for energy for 2024, and it's very upbeat in a lot of ways. Peak oil's about to happen, it says, before the end of the decade. It's saying we're into the electric age, and yet we see that when it comes to Europe, you just heard Peter mention it, starting an industry from scratch seems daunting.
Yeah, I mean, the problem in Europe, you know, you have three big markets. You have Europe, you have the US, and you have China. There is two countries, two continents who are pursuing an industrial base. They want to have to produce those cars, and that's China, of course, which have started to work a long time ago on electric car because they skipped the ICE. They went directly to electric cars, and they hired thousands of engineers to develop those batteries. BYD has 90,000 engineers. Our engineers in Europe, they go to work in banks and do some weird stuff. In China, they just go and work on electric cars. And the US, you have the Inflation Reduction Act, which Joe Biden put, which subsidized battery factory up to 50% of the cost. So it's like tax rebate, and which give grants for cars which are produced made in USA. So those two countries have an industrial approach. But in Europe, it has nothing to do with this. The electric car market is artificial.
But isn't that changing, Nicolas?
In Europe, it's artificial. You have artificial because you have CO2 targets. So OEM, they just set the numbers of cars that they need to sell. So next year, they'll have to sell a bit more. They're going to push a bit, and then they are okay up to 2030. That's artificial. And also, you have those, as you say, subsidies. Of course, subsidies are being reduced. But the problem why in Europe they did big car, because the regulation encouraged OEMs to do big electric cars, big SUVs, and people can't afford it because it's too expensive. In China, if you take a small electric car, it's cheaper than its equivalent, its ICE, its gasoline equivalent. And that's why in China, in September, more than one new car out of two was electric. So from next year onward, we're going to start to see some smaller car, some cheaper car, but guess what? Some of them, they're going to come from China, like the partners from Stellantis, Leap Motor, which is presenting its cars in Paris Motor Show, which is going to come with very nice cars for a very good price.
Very nice cars for a very good price. Do you agree, Maria Eugenia, that the help from Europe, from European governments has been artificial, as Nicolas put it?
Well, I think that regulations in all the countries we are talking about have been pushing for electric vehicles, and in some countries, it's funny because we may say, in China it's not artificial. It is, in any case, artificial in the sense that there is always a policy behind the industrialization or the developments, and this has been like that historically, also for other things.
But you heard Nicolas say that in China they're putting the accent more on more affordable
on the value
models.
chain. Yeah, so there is this strategy, this differentiation strategy, which is well known also in this type of industry. So we have chosen to go to the high end, and they have chosen to go to the lower end in terms of the new car vehicles. And so now we are we have this problem that we are not producing, and we have not had this differentiation in terms of the low-end electric vehicles. And the way to approach this is, well, if we actually want to continue in this strategy, which I guess has been chosen for profits in firms, we need to solve the affordability problem with other strategies, like giving more access to public services where people need the car. So greening the fleets, but instead of greening the fleet, substituting with cars, giving easily access to the places people need to go, so that they don't need the car any longer. I don't.
Yeah, which is already the case in a lot of major cities.
Which is already the case, but if you
more and more so because of mobility has been rethought. I'm thinking about what you were saying earlier, Peter Siegel, about the fact that starting from the ground up in a new industry, because in effect that's what this has been proving difficult. And Northvolt, we were talking about, that's only existed since 2016. It's not an institution like, say, Europe's largest car maker, Volkswagen, which for the first time in its history announced last month it was contemplating layoffs for some of its 130,000 workers in Germany. Here you see the green economy minister, Robert Habeck, at a plant in the North Sea port of Emden last month. Emden, which has phased out the Passat, for instance, in favor of EVs. Robert Habeck, who spoke with union reps.
We are looking for all the help we can get. On the one hand, of course, there are internal negotiations going on at Volkswagen, and perhaps something needs to be changed. On the other hand, we have noticed that in the last year, subsidies for e-mobility have been cancelled overnight. We noticed that. The number of orders have since collapsed.
Volkswagen was more than just Europe's largest car company. It was Europe's largest company at one point. What's happened? What did the Germans do? What's going on with the Germans?
Well, there's a couple of things happening at Volkswagen. It is true that Germany did pull its EV subsidies in December, and that's actually the cause of a lot of the EV slump in Europe, because Germany is the largest market in Europe.
And what is it, just the obsession with having a balanced budget, and so they don't...
Yeah, it was for budgetary reasons in Germany, so they pulled the EV subsidies in December, and their market cratered. But Volkswagen itself, however, their big issue, frankly, right now is China. China is their biggest individual market. Brands like Audi and Porsche make a lot of money in China, but there's a huge price war going on in China right now, especially among domestic EV makers. And Volkswagen can't compete there, so they're losing sales in China in a big way. They've issued 2 profit warnings this year for investors, and they're contemplating layoffs now in Germany, which, as you mentioned, is somewhat unheard of for a company that is the pride of Germany, essentially.
So China's an export market, but they're caught up in a domestic price war there.
Not for VW. They have 39 factories in China. VW Group has 39 factories. Some build cars, some build components. They do export some cars, higher-end cars, to China. That gets to another question of the potential trade war if the EU tariffs are made permanent, or how they're made permanent. So Volkswagen is against permanent tariffs on Chinese EVs for those reasons. So Volkswagen's sort of snared up in this international web of commerce that they've dined out on China for so many years. And now, to sort of mangle a metaphor, the dinner's looking a little thin right now. So,
all right, let's take this from the top. Back at the Paris Motor Show we go. The competition hiding in plain sight. Most everyone checking out those new Chinese models. Brian Quinn has more.
At the 2024 Paris Motor Show, the atmosphere is electric. EVs are everywhere at the Biennial Car Expo, and Chinese manufacturers like BYD are out in force, boasting of technological advances that will allow them to keep up with or outperform their Western rivals.
You must know that we have more than 100,000 engineers, so basically we are having 15 patterns approved every day of the week.
With domestic consumption slumping, the Chinese government has sought to boost exports to prop up its ailing economy, providing heavily subsidized land and power to new factories in sectors like green energy equipment and EVs. The resulting glut of cheap exports is threatening to undercut Western industries. In response, the U.S. has imposed import tariffs of 100% on Chinese EVs. The EU, too, is set to hike its tariffs from 10% up to 45% at the end of the month.
I think we're forced to adopt a minimum of protectionism, because a lot of big players like the Americans are doing it. If we don't do a bit ourselves, we run the risk of sinking our industry, especially the automotive industry, which is a French treasure.
In a bid to skirt those EU tariffs, Chinese companies are not only partnering with European firms, they're also building their own factories on the continent to produce cars within the bloc. Europe is already the largest export market for Chinese EVs, and with the sale of new petrol cars set to be banned here by 2035, it's a market that is only likely to expand.
So, Peter Siegel, you've had a butcher's, as they say, at the Paris Motor Show. What do you think of these models?
Well, the Chinese cars, there's no question that they are technically advanced, technologically advanced, priced right, and fairly attractive, especially the full electric.
Could you feel the buzz when you were like in that hall number 5 at the at the
yeah, absolutely. And the last couple of motor shows, the last big one was in Munich. The Chinese vehicles were sort of the stars of the show. This year it was probably the French cars, but the Chinese cars had a big presence. Less than you might think, though, because of the impending or potentially impending EV tariffs. But they're very attractive propositions.
All right. Earlier this month, EU member states narrowly backed import duties on Chinese-made EVs up to 45%. And again, you've been hearing the damned if you do, damned if you don't conundrum for Germany's government from Peter. It's export, the tariffs, though, the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, well, he says he's against them. He spoke earlier at the Bundestag, the German parliament.
I spoke to the bosses of BMW, Volkswagen, Opel, Ford, Mercedes and many others, and they all said, no, we don't want that. That is why we acted accordingly in Brussels. 17 countries were also sceptical, and my demand is there must be an agreement now between China and the European Union.
Nicolas Melon, I don't know how many of those 16 other countries are produce cars, but your reaction listening there to the German Chancellor?
Well, it was probably due to happen. I mean, if you look abroad, what's going on, if you look in the US, US have a 100% import tax on Chinese car. There is not a single Chinese electric car sold in the US. The Canada just put a 100% import tax on Chinese car. You have other countries like
Is it
Turkey.
Justified?
Well, what do you mean by justified? They just want to
protect
their industry.
Are the tariffs justified? Yeah.
They want to protect their industry, and that's working pretty well. So you have to know that in Europe, China has never sold any car, any regular ICE car. But today, China is already the second producer of electric cars sold in Europe. Behind Germany, France is number 5. And there is no reason that it doesn't become number 1. Because if you look at this target, where we should have 100% of electric cars sold by 2035, even the European Cour des comptes européenne, they just said, look, we can't meet the target with European car. We'd have to buy the cars in China. We don't have the cars, we don't have the batteries, we don't have the material. And that's the problem. Even if we try to do this nice project, the Airbus of the battery was nice, but guess what's the biggest problem in Europe? We pay our electricity and our gas 4 times as high as in the US, 4 times as high as in China. And you can't produce batteries with an electricity and gas, which is 4 times more expensive than your competitors. Can't work.
Marijana Sanin, do you agree that Europe's at a dead end of this issue of batteries?
Regarding the batteries, I think that's maybe the option, the best option for Europe is actually to go into these other parts of the value chain, like thinking about reshuffling. There are these initiatives on recycling. I know this is more for the future.
So you agree that actually producing batteries is just too energy consuming for Europeans?
Well, I don't think it's just the energy on that note. Nowadays, we have this energy crisis that we are living. And in fact, if you look at, but this is not exclusively true for batteries. This is true for all in the European industry. Indeed, there's a slowdown in the car market. It's been much more strong since we had the Ukrainian crisis. So this is not only for electric vehicles, but this is something we need to think about more generally. What do we want to do with our industry, and which is our strategy in terms of energy transition to at the same time be competitive and succeed the energy transition? And this is a wider question that is related to the availability of raw materials and these regulations on the Raw Materials Act. I mean, this is a more complex question than just the one we are analyzing. So
there's so much at stake here. You know, we're talking about so many jobs across the continent. Can Europe get its act? Doesn't it have to? I mean, you can't let its automobile industry die.
This is not what I want to say. What I want to say is that maybe the strategy is not to try to compete with China on that segment, but try to compete in other segments and take other activities that where we can maybe succeed.
Peter Siegel?
I think that's correct about batteries. The European Union did have what they call an IPCEI, which is an important project of common European interest to try to funnel investment towards battery factories. And so far, the only one that's operating is one factory that's jointly funded by Stellantis, Mercedes, and Total Saft. One so far. If you include Northvolt, which I do not think will make it. There are, however, some Chinese battery factories in Eastern Europe, which they sort of brought over from China. So batteries are probably a dead end, unfortunately. Specialized semiconductors might be another way into the EV value chain. A lot of the designs for Chinese electric vehicles are penned by European designers who, work in Italy but design cars for the Chinese EV industry. But it's probably...
Europeans are good in infrastructure also,
yeah.
Because if we have electric vehicles, we need the infrastructure that goes with the electric vehicles, and European firms have been pretty good at building infrastructure, efficient and resilient infrastructure. So I think we need to think outside of the box.
But as a larger question, can Europe get its act together to produce subsidized EVs the way China has with a very comprehensive plan, or the U.S. with its Inflation Reduction Act?
Is there no way around some kind of protectionism on this?
Well, there are some possible alternatives to straight-up tariffs, one of which would be, for instance, minimum prices. And just to give a tiny bit of historical context, in the 1980s, the Japanese automakers had excess capacity just the way the Chinese automakers do. Looking for an export market, they focused on Europe. The European automakers got together and said, we don't want the Japanese automakers dumping cheap cars here, so they put on quotas. Well, what happened? The Japanese came in, built factories. The Toyota factory in northern France is a model factory of the Toyota production system. People got to see it in real time. Honda, Nissan built factories in the UK. So BYD has announced they're going to build a factory in Hungary. Chery, another Chinese company, wants to build a factory in Spain, which could explain why Spain is against the protection, the tariffs. So the end game of this is probably the Chinese automakers, if they wish to sell here, will have to build in Europe.
Now, the goal is to retire, because don't forget, we do have a planet that's overheating, Nicolas Mélan, is to retire gasoline-powered vehicles by the year 2035. So you've just heard the panel here, Mario Eugenia saying, all right, we probably can say goodbye to trying to make our own batteries, but we can still produce EVs and meet that target. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was just said by Peter. Our best bet is what we did with Toyota. What we just want is, obviously, China, they are ahead technologically on the batteries, on the cars. But what we want is for them to produce them in Europe, in France, could be. Because for the time being, for example, if you take BYD, they are the first factory in Hungary. I mean, you mentioned it, Peter, the Japanese did it pretty well, but we can talk about the South Korean as well, which put some plant in Eastern Europe to flow their car into the whole Europe. But now BYD second plant is supposed to be in Turkey, because Turkey has an agreement with the European Union. And then from Turkey, they'll be able to send their car to the European Union.
Is that a problem?
Well, the problem could be that, for example, if you take the electricity mix in Turkey, it's not exactly green. It's a lot made out of coal. So I put up a proposition where I think we should probably put a tax on imported carbon. That's a big problem we have in France. More of 50% of our carbon footprint is imported, and it would be a way to limit, imports of products which are made out of coal, and electric cars from China and batteries actually are part of it. So there is some solution, and I think this one is. I'm going to push it a bit in a couple of. I'm going to be publishing that with Engineers Europe shortly, and that's probably a good way for Europe to put its hand together and get maybe a small, tiny chance to reindustrialize.
Well, just to interject quickly, France has essentially done that by pulling their EV subsidies for Chinese EVs, but they didn't do it by saying it's Chinese EVs. They said, we're going to look at the entire carbon footprint of the car. So that also snared EVs made in Japan and South Korea. So they don't receive a subsidy in France anymore this year based on the carbon footprint. Maybe they could extend that to Turkey, although again, complicated because Renault has a factory in Turkey. So you can see how complicated this gets when you think about it.
That's actually my idea, and that's an idea I gave to the government 5 years ago. So I'm happy that they took it with them. But I have a new idea, and I hope they take it as well.
All right, Mary-Jane Sanin.
Yeah, so it is true that, moreover, this has even a psychological impact in the sense that if you understand, even if maybe there are some Chinese cars that by any chance could pass through this regulation, people just have in mind that if I have a Chinese car, I won't be able to get the subsidy. So people are going, it's more, we are likely
bad publicity.
Yeah. We will most probably see that Chinese cars are do not perform that well in France due to that regulation.
If you're a betting woman, would you say that the EU will not blink and that it will stick to this 2035 deadline for phasing out gasoline-powered vehicles?
I think it's been used indeed, as you said in the introduction, as this publicity even for populist governments, in the sense that the first thing we need to understand is that we are only talking about new cars for 2035. And so these new cars are already quite expensive. Even if they are gasoline cars or hybrid cars, they are already quite big. And so there is the shift in this market is moving into that direction in any case.
Between now and 2035, there'll be those used cars you mentioned earlier on the market.
There still be, most of the cars are still going to be gasoline hybrid, and all the cars we're producing today. And most of the people we know are going to continue to use those cars. It's just for the people that can afford a new car, which are the richest and the oldest people, actually, in statistically.
All right, so present Tuesday at the Paris Motor Show, the leader of Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally Party, Jordan Bardella, the National Rally, which campaigns on a pledge of protecting fuel-driven vehicles and reversing that 2035 deadline for phasing them out. That kind of mirrors what we saw, Peter Siegel, in the United States with when Donald Trump now goes to campaign in vehicle-producing Michigan. He says, they're going to take away your cars. How much, pardon the pun, traction are politicians getting from these
I think that in the United States, the Republican Party is getting a fair amount of traction from this. Although you'd have to explain to me why Trump is buddies with Elon Musk. That I don't quite understand. To say we're going to take away EV subsidies or take away, we're going to protect your gasoline cars, but here's Elon Musk. But that's a side issue. I think in Europe we haven't quite yet seen the sort of the culture war against electric vehicles. We got a small taste of what happens though when affordability is an issue with the Gilets jaunes movement in France, which was sort of set off.
Or more recently in Germany, the backlash against phasing out gas boilers, which the far right made political hay.
Yeah, it can be politicized, especially when it's a pocketbook issue. So, we had Macron himself. Emmanuel Macron went through the Paris show too, and he was very much focused on electric vehicles and the affordable electric vehicles we saw from Citroën and Renault. So I wouldn't call Macron the most greenest politician out there, but he does back French industry, and the French industry right now is focused on building electric vehicles.
Nicolas Mélan, your thoughts on, again, I'll put the same question I put to you earlier after seeing those images of the leader of the party of Marine Le Pen there at the Paris Motor Show. Will that 2035 deadline stick?
If you look at a country like Norway, for example, which is the paradise for electric cars, their deadline was 2025, and guess what? They're going to meet the deadline because, like in August, for example, 98% of cars were electric in Norway, of new cars sold. And we are lagging 7 to 8 years behind Norway. They will be there in 2025. So there's no reason we are not there in 2035. The problem is not whether we'll be there. The problem will be with which cars. Will it be European cars or Chinese cars, made in China, made in Europe? That's the big question. But we'll probably be there.
The culture wars over cars, mirroring what the Pew Institute found in a survey conducted a year ago in the United States. 73% of registered Republicans said they would be upset if the U.S. stopped making gasoline vehicles. And again, because we're less than 3 weeks out from the U.S. presidential election, and Nicolas spelled out at the beginning that there's 3 big markets for making vehicles, the Far East, Europe, and North America. In an interview with the news director of the Bloomberg News Agency Tuesday, Donald Trump promising tariffs on cars for China, Mexico, Europe, recalling the time when he was president and Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany.
I said, Angela, how many Chevrolets do we have in Berlin? Why, Donald, you have none. He said, that's right. How many Fords do we have in Frankfurt? I don't know, none. I said, that's right. You know how many cars we have? Mercedes-Benz, BMW, all of the different Volkswagen, millions and millions of cars. To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. And it's my favorite word. It needs a public relations firm to help it.
Peter Siegel, is this just campaign talk? Don't pay too much.
A lot of it is. I mean,
right.
BMW's biggest factory is in South Carolina. He's not going to start a trade war with BMW or Mercedes, which has a huge factory in Alabama. He also promised to put a 200% tariff on EVs made in Mexico. Well,
that's impossible.
That's impossible. There are no EVs made in Mexico. So some of it, yes, some of it is campaign demagoguery, for sure.
And but this call for tariffs, what does that tell you about the times we live in?
Well, I think it tells you that sort of globalism is under threat. People are sort of looking at what a global economy really means, and in some cases they're not liking what they see. Not necessarily politicians, but people who are working and earning a living and having to pay maybe higher prices in their own country. Others maybe paying lower prices for some goods, but realizing that it comes at a cost of in the United States you lose your manufacturing economy. So I think that's probably where some of the traction that tariffs and protectionism are getting now comes from.
And you remember during COVID, Marie-Jenny Senin, it seems like a long time ago, but there was all this talk about let's shorten supply chains. In fact, the far right says we're pro-environment, we're for shortening the supply chains. But so how does that work?
I think that the very we were discussing about that earlier this week in the news. So indeed, the far right is profiting from the fact that since we've been in this crisis, also in the COVID crisis, Ukrainian war, the public expenditure has been shrinking, and so there's access to hospital, public services, etc., are more difficult, and so they became more dependent on the car instead of less dependent on the car, especially outside of Paris, in faraway regions. And so these people have important affordability issues. They were in the Gilets jaunes movement, and now we're telling them, and next cars, you will probably buy them when they are old, but their starting price is going to be higher because they're going to be electric. And so they don't even have access to infrastructure in general. And so in those towns are where the far right is actually rising, because these people feel abandoned, and it's understandable, right? So maybe the way to transition our economies is to increase access to services in those regions and avoid simply having or using the car, and then greening these high-end cars, which is where our European industry is going, because our European industry has been building cars that are more of the luxury end or the high-end cars as compared to the Chinese equivalent. So I think that this transition the way we've been talking about the energy transition has been playing has been facilitating this populist discourse.
But if you live in a faraway suburb or in the countryside, you're always going to need your car, won't you?
Well, if we look at the trends in terms of access to shopping areas, cultural sites, sports, hospitals, this has been reducing outside of big cities in most of European countries, and in particular in France. So yes, you're going to need a car, but maybe you're going to, if we improve infrastructure, at least in some neural points, people are going to need less the car or less frequently the car. And we can think about these social leasing alternatives, other alternatives that is not just owning a car. We need to know that the poorest people in France, the car they are able to afford is a 4,000 euros car. So there is room for improving services and think about services. And that's a good news because this can only be done here in Europe. We cannot import those infrastructure or services from China. So we need to think about this in a more general way and not just looking at the value chain in the EV, in the traditional EV that we have today.
Yeah, I did think that France's social leasing program this year was a really good idea, and it
more subsidies for.
Well, yes, for people could lease people
for those
with a certain
who have
income level could
pocketbook.
lease an electric car for 100 to 140 or 50 euros a month. It was a great idea and it was very popular. The money ran out quickly, which means that it was a success.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. So much more to talk about. Peter Siegel, I want to thank you, and thank as well Marie-Eugenia Sanin. Nicolas Mélan, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.